So now let's look at some rules for using text. Some of them are going to be pretty basic and pretty easy to get, and others will be a little bit harder to grasp and a little bit more subjective, which just means what you might think looks okay might not look okay for what we are trying to do, and that's to design for an audience. So let's look at the first one, and that is avoid the default fonts. And those would be things like Times New Roman, those fonts that are always on your computer. And it's just because they're used a lot. The next one uses something that we just kind of learned about, and that is contrast. And it tells you to use contrasting font families. So when you're designing, you'll have one thing that's called a headline font and one that's called a body font or a secondary font. And basically what you want to do is make sure that you have one more designed font, which would be that headline font. So I kind of think of it as the fun font. And then your secondary font is going to be very clean and simple. Think about those watermarks that we made, or just a nice clean font. This is the one where we have the most problems, and that is watch the legibility. And I know you've heard me say it over and over. I just said it is nice, clean fonts. Now, I know that this says legibility, but it's really difficult to see. And if your audience doesn't know what you're saying, you might just have a little bit of confusion. So just save those funky fonts and don't use those except for very, very sparingly. Next, you'll definitely want to steer clear of cliche and just kind of ugly fonts. Now, these are the ones that, again, are default on your computers, and people have thought, oh, well, that looks nice. And so it's just been used over and over and over again. We have our Comic Sans that teachers love to use because they think it's fun and it looks like handwriting. And it's just in the design world, they're kind of a no-no because they're overused, and now it's just kind of a joke to use them. So we definitely don't want to use those. We want to move beyond that and find some new original fonts that we can use instead. We have already looked at this one also, and that's to adjust your line spacing. And you might not realize it, but we have looked at that, and I have told you to make sure that your words are on separate lines, and that's how you adjust your line spacing. You don't want the default area in between. You kind of want to think of it as a puzzle. And if you look at the first one, those adjust your line, the adjust your is one line and the line spacing is another, and so I was able to move it around and make it all look like it belongs together using our old friend proximity. And on the bottom one that says adjust your line spacing, I just hit enter and it just has the basic width. We don't want to do that. We always want to have different lines on our design. Here we have an actual name for something that we looked at when we were looking at contrast, and that is reverse type. And that's where your background is a color instead of just white. There are times when you can use it and it can look great. I actually really like the title that I made where it says of reverse type. You definitely don't need to avoid it totally, but you do want to avoid the examples here that we have, the yellow on orange, the red on the blue, which a lot of people like. We just want to make sure it's outlined in white or something. You don't want to do any fancy fonts because they're hard to read. You just want thick, nice, clean, simple fonts. When designing, it's a good idea to use two fonts just to add a little bit of interest to your design. Now, there are circumstances where one font is perfectly fine, especially with typography posters. But two fonts is always a good policy. You usually have a headline font. In this example, they're kind of both headline fonts, but more the script font with U's, and then your secondary font would be the two fonts. It's just a little bit more simple, even though it is a little bit bigger in this example. The last and probably actually the most important rule would be to know the font's personality. You don't want to make the mistake of choosing a serious font when you are creating something that's light-hearted. So make sure that the font that you choose matches the mood that you are trying to create with whatever it is you're creating. Your invitation, your poster, whatever you're making, your font needs to match the mood.